Hey, this is Goodfellas History. I'm your host, Nick,
I'm Davis.
And I'm Garrett.
and today we're going to talk about the Iraq War. More importantly, the history of the Iraq War, how we got there, why we're there now. So, as you guys know, the Iraq War is one of the longest wars that the United States has been involved in, and the only one that's been the longest is Afghanistan, which is hopefully going to be ending soon. Fingers crossed. So, how much history do you guys know about the Iraq War?
Honestly, that it happened, and I know like a little bit of I've seen like a couple clips of like politicians basically being like, "This is why we need to get in there, and this is why we need to do this," but I don't know a ton behind that.
I know like bits and pieces, but it definitely couldn't like give like a very detailed like explanation. Um, but I know like bits and pieces.
So, the history of the Iraq War is really complicated because it kind of gets into Cold War history and post-Cold War doctrines and history as well. So, the history of the Iraq War has a lot to do with the United States' history with the government of Iraq. So, Saddam Hussein, and particularly the Ba'ath Party of Iraq, was backed by the United States during the 1980s, largely due to the fact that Saddam Hussein was at war with Iran. So, during the end of the Cold War, Iran, which is going to be an important player in this whole discussion, so, get used to hearing Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Lebanon, and Israel, because they're all going to be players in this. Iran, the Shah of Iran, who was basically the imperial, descendant of the Empire Persia, basically would be a way of putting it, was ousted from power, and the Shah of Iran was a ally to the United States, and the Shah, the Emperor, or the Shah of Iran, was a U.S. ally. We helped basically reinstate him in his power in the 1950s in a joint operation led by the United States and Britain, known as Operation Ajax. It was one of the first times that the U.S. CIA really sank its teeth in basically shaping foreign governments. And it was a joint venture by the British and the United States to make sure that Iran's oil reserves, particularly the oil wells that were on the Gulf Coast, remained under British and American interests. The Shah, in return to protecting those interests, would be backed by the United States and given military training and access to technology and education, which we basically delivered. So from the mid-1950s up into the late 1970s, the Shah of Iran essentially was the one-man ruler of Iran. And in late 1979, a figure known as the Ayatollah, a man by the name of Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, led a anti-Shah Islamic revolution in Iran and toppled the Shah of Iran. This, of course, was under the Carter presidency, and Carter basically allowed the Shah to come to the United States. Some misconceptions was that during this time, immediately, the Ayatollah and the Islamists faction in Iran attacked the U.S. Embassy. It wasn't until the United States accepted the Shah of Iran that the Islamists attacked U.S. embassies and captured one of the embassies with all of the ambassadors and their staff. As a result. So this led to a standoff between Iran and the United States, and just so happens at the same time a powerful figure in Iraq had just seized power less than a decade earlier, and his name was Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein wanted to expand Iraqi power, and he saw one way of doing this as, capturing more oil wells. This would give Iraq more leverage when it came to the oil market. The United States under this time was looking for any kind of leverage to kind of gain back some control of those oil wells, because this was just after the great oil, embargo led by OPEC. So energy prices were already a complicated issue. So the United States ended up supporting Saddam Hussein. And we found covert and overt ways of arming, training, and delivering a considerable amount of weaponry to Saddam Hussein, including the chemical weapons that he would eventually use against his own people. That was sold by the German government to Saddam Hussein, or at least the resources that would make it available for him to produce chemical weapons were sold by Germany. The United States put a lot of pressure on the Western governments to do this. This was the beginning of the tie between France and the Saddam Hussein regime, particularly when it came to oil interests. So the French were willing to go along with it so long as there was a deal in place that allowed them to keep their energy levels low, and Iraq would sell oil cheaply to them. Now this is really complicated because it's Cold War history, and I don't think I have enough time even today to explain all of it. But suffice to say, Saddam Hussein received a huge amount of support from the West, particularly the United States, and was able to develop a war machine that was arguably the most powerful army in the region, only rivaled by the Turkish military. And this happened under a decade. And Saddam Hussein, with this new army, basically declared war on Iran. And this would be almost a decade-long war in the 1980s. This would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And during this time, Saddam Hussein suppressed the Shia population of Iraq, which was the majority population, largely due to the fact that he was concerned that because the Ayatollah was a major Shia figure, which was the predominant religion of Iran at the time, the Muslim variant, that he needed to suppress them in case they decided to rebel against him. Another group that he would suppress during this period of time would be the Kurds, who he would, mercilessly attack because they were an ethnic deviation. So not only were there religious challenges, but there also were ethnic tensions between Saddam Hussein and the Kurdish people. This decades-long war would lead to absolute devastation in western Iran and eastern Iraq. And the Iranian government got so desperate that they basically began a campaign of suicide charges. These suicide charges would be made up of young men who would just basically run forward to be bullet catchers, and if they got close enough to the enemy, to throw grenades. This actually proved very successful, as the Iraqi military really didn't have much of a counter to this. Invading Iran was incredibly difficult because it was very mountainous. And the territory that they wanted to control was difficult to capture because it was hard for them to maintain supply lines. Eventually, the Iran-Iraq War came to a standstill. In fact, this war is interesting enough because it also exposed another major CIA conspiracy. So this region is filled with all sorts of conspiracies and bad behavior from the United States government. You guys have heard of the Iran-Contra deal, right?
Briefly, but yeah.
So, during the time when we were financing Saddam Hussein, we were also selling weapons to Iran indirectly to finance the Contras in South America. And, so all this is happening at the same time, right? And so this damn near toppled the Reagan administration as a result. Eventually, Iraq and Iran would settle down and indemnities would be passed. Saddam Hussein, seeking a way of saving face, would eventually lead a campaign into conquering Kuwait. And this would lead to the initial Gulf War between George Herbert Walker Bush and Saddam Hussein. And the reason why Saddam Hussein captured Kuwait is Kuwait, believe had somewhere around 30 to 40% of the oil reserves in the region. So it's a very wealthy region. It's a very wealthy population. And Saddam Hussein wanted to have access to those oil wells. And with this, he felt that he could get leverage and more support from the Western world. This backfired, of course. And the United States essentially worked with Saudi Arabia, who was concerned with the rising power of Iraq, and were concerned with the fact that Iraq was beginning to displace them as the United States' favorite Arab ally in the region. Put a lot of pressure on the United States and offered a considerable amount of leverage and leeway to the United States in regards to the oil reserves that existed in Saudi Arabia to basically entice the United States to do something about Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. So in 1991, the United States, with a coalition and with the support of the UN and a lot of foreign allies and foreign interests, declared war, or declared a police action, because Congress didn't declare war, and invaded Kuwait to drive out the Iraqi military. The key thing with that is that the United States agreed with all the powers in the region that it would not invade Iraq proper. This was about getting the Iraqi military out of Kuwait. During that time, the United States essentially wiped out somewhere around 60 to 70% of the military interests of Iraq. So the Iraqi military suffered in a brief, within a 3-month period of time, suffered more hard casualties to the United States than it had during the Iraq-Iran war.
So we obliterated them. That's crazy.
We also bombed the living hell out of Iraq. So there were quite a few civilian casualties as a result. Iraq, after the war, was subject to incredibly harsh sanctions that only got harsher and harsher. And it just so happened that the only way for those sanctions to be softened, as if the Iraqi government, ergo Saddam Hussein, would be allowing for cheaper oil prices to be deposited to Europe. I believe in 95 or 96, the Food for Oil program, although the French didn't call it that, it essentially was that, was implemented, where the French would basically trade foodstuffs for oil as a way of sustaining the Iraqi economy. Iraq went from having one of the stronger GDPs in the region to having one of the worst. And the standard of living, of course, went down and down and down as a result of these sanctions. Fun fact, the presence of the United States military in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula radicalized a certain figure by the name of Osama bin Laden, who had just come back fighting the Russians in Afghanistan for about a decade with the Mujahideen and the Taliban, or would eventually become the Taliban. And he just so happened to come back to Saudi Arabia with his group of followers, and they were the beginnings of Al-Qaeda. So our involvement in the Gulf War inadvertently resulted in the unification and the radicalization of Al-Qaeda from a fairly pro-U.S., anti-Western but pro-U.S. group to an anti-U.S., anti-Western group.
Yeah, and I already knew that we had basically made Al-Qaeda and whatnot, but it's crazy to hear just how bad it was to get to that point.
Well, a lot of people don't realize that all these things are kind of happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first phase of this. So after this, Iraq and the Middle East go through the 90s, and the collapse of the Soviet Union around the same time resulted in a considerable amount of munitions and radicalization in the former Soviet republics to take place. One of the first places that Al-Qaeda was active before 9/11 was actually in Chechnya, fighting against Russians. There was even some discussion of going to Bosnia to fight against the Serbs during the Balkan conflict that took place. So that festers for about a decade, and Iraq's standard of living keeps going down, down, down. But the foreign policy apparatus in the United States is kind of divided. They want they want Iraq. There's a group of them that we could call neocons, who wanted basically the United States to go in and topple the regimes of Iraq, Iran, and Syria, because they were resistant to U.S. interests. Iraq was the keystone of that. And so for about a decade they pushed nonstop the narrative of Saddam Hussein as Hitler, Saddam Hussein as the war criminal, which he was, Saddam Hussein as the dictator, and all the evils and horrors of the Hussein government, which, was true. They were horrible. But they also kept with this narrative of he might be secretly developing weapons of mass destruction. This would result in a air bombing campaign led by Bill Clinton in the mid-90s to basically attack warehouses that the CIA and the intelligence agencies were claiming were filled with possible material that would lead to development of weapons of mass destruction. So get used to hearing that term a lot.
Yeah.
Because that was the key thing, the weapons of mass destruction. And this allowed the president, and a lot of the reasons why the weapons of mass destruction narrative was used is that there already were policies in place that were passed by Congress that gave the President of the United States considerable leeway in military operations when it came to those kinds of threats. So we get to the 2000 election. George A. Bush is elected President of the United States. And the end result of that is the foreign policy relationship between Iraq and the Middle East begins to decline almost immediately. For obvious reasons. It was pretty clear from the get-go. George W. Bush surrounded himself with many people that were in the previous Bush administration, who were of the neocon mindset of the United States needs to go into the Middle East and topple these regimes. And from the get-go, there's pretty clear evidence due to files being leaked and documentation that the administration was looking for any reason to invade Iraq, to topple the Saddam Hussein regime, to basically gain control of Iraq. Now, before we get into the Iraq War, I want to explain kind of the geopolitical structure of Iraq. Now, I've used the words Sunni and Kurds. Do you guys know the geopolitical history of the region at all?
Only slightly. I know, like, the Sunni, it's mostly just, like, religious-based things, right?
The Sunni
With the
Shia
Kurds,
is a religious division.
Mm-hmm.
But the Kurds are an ethnic minority.
Okay.
That I believe are predominantly Sunni, but I could be wrong on that. So, most of western Iraq is made up of Sunnis. They are a minority population, but because in western Iraq is where a good chunk of oil fields are, the Sunni population has a considerable amount of wealth and leverage. The Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein were Sunni Arabs, although the majority of the population in Iraq were Shia Arabs. So the Shia population live and predominant in the center of Iraq, Baghdad, and southeastern Iraq. So if you think of Iraq as like three triangles, the western triangle is mostly Sunni Arab. The northern triangle is mostly Sunni Kurdish, and the rest of the country is Shia Arab in population. Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party are predominantly Sunni, and this is known as the era of oppression by the Shia, because the Sunnis do everything in their power to keep the Shia as second-class citizens and repressed. So 9/11 happens. The United States invades Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is its own deck of cards. I could talk about the history of that sometime in the future because it's even a bigger mess. There are even more moving parts in Afghanistan. Suffice to say, this gives the Bush administration a lot of political capital. And there are quite a few neocons, even in the Democratic Party, who want to do something about Iraq. So I know you guys were really young when the build-up of the war was taking place, but I want to tell you guys that weapons of mass destruction was the keystone of all the arguments. The key reason why Congress authorized the United States invasion of Iraq and the funding for it was because of weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, as I said, I was like a little kid when this was going on, but I can still remember, as I said, the yellow cake vial. He's like, they've got yellow cake over there. They have this like weapons of mass destruction. They're forming that. I can still remember that even as a little kid.
So
like,
the biggest thing
on the news,
I can explain to you from basically late 2001 to the Congress authorization. Weapons of mass destruction and war crimes were nonstop. The history of Saddam Hussein's regime, it was on blast. There was nowhere you could turn where the Iraq War was not being discussed, or the potential for the Iraq War being discussed. And the opposition to it was very controlled. You never heard anybody make the argument of long-term policies, how we would get out. The only major media figure who said anything negative about the Iraq War was a man by the name of Phil Donahue, and he was working for MSNBC at the time. He had one of the most popular shows, and they fired him because he came out.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I think, was her name Barbara Lee? She was the only one in Congress to vote no, I believe. So in terms of Congress, she was, I think, the sole voice on that side. She said we need to kind of take a step back.
Yeah.
Look at everything.
So, I will tell you guys that virtually everywhere, people were pushing the narrative of Saddam Hussein was secretly developing weapons of mass destruction. When you look at the underlying investigation of it, it's pretty clear that it's bullshit, because a lot of the investigation didn't even take place in Iraq. It was from outside sources in places like Romania and the Balkans. And these were sources that were exiles of the Saddam Hussein regime, giving these statements, often under torturous circumstances. So, not good. Not good information. It didn't help that the UN actually sent in an investigatory team to actually investigate to see if Iraq actually was developing weapons of mass destruction. And they toured the facilities, the only facilities in Iraq that were capable of developing said yellow uranium, the uranium cake, and they found no evidence of it happening. And I remember once this happened, there was a lot of narrative of the UN colluding with Saddam Hussein. This led to France, Germany, and Russia, of all countries, to rise up and declare that they would not get involved and were resistant or were against the war itself. For France and Germany, the obvious reasons for that was due to their financial and economic investment in Iraq, particularly the oil for food programs. There were humanitarian reasons why, of course, and in the United States there was an anti-war movement that was beginning to develop, but it was very small, it was very marginal. This is when the Dixie Chicks basically wrote their song that pissed off right-wing America and got them kicked out of the country tour, I guess. But essentially, eventually, the Iraq War took place. And the end result, of course, was the United States unilaterally invading Iraq without the same kind of fanfare and support in the region that we had during the first Gulf War. And the only other nations that seemed to ally with us at that time were either new NATO states, like Poland supported us, Australia and Great Britain and Canada supported us, but that was about it. Key thing is that the only Middle Eastern country outside of Israel to support us was Kuwait. So Saudi Arabia, Iran, Lebanon, and Turkey and Syria did not support the war. Now, if you know where Iraq is in the Middle East, you can understand why that's not a really good thing.
Yeah, literally, like, completely all around it, basically.
Pretty much. And this is while we're still fighting a war in Afghanistan. So for the Iranians, there are now two countries, arguably maybe even three countries with Pakistan, who are more aligned with the United States interests now that are on their borders. So, yeah, that should make everybody kind of pause for a second and go, oh shit.
Yeah, like, that's absolutely crazy.
So, the United States invade Iraq, and the military, even the military of Iraq was blown away. But unlike the first time, which was even more restrained, there were civilian casualties. I told you they bombed the hell out of Iraq. There was even less restraints this time around. The United States committed itself to various war crimes. We bombed vital infrastructure like dams that provided energy. We hit canals. We surprisingly did not hit any of the oil reserves for obvious reasons.
Yeah, makes sense. Money.
And we essentially seized control of Iraq within, I want to say, less than 6 months. And within that 6-month period of time, the discussion went from weapons of mass destruction to democracy in Iraq. Now, I want you guys to understand, the main reason why the United States went to war in Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. This was the reason why we had authorization. Weapons of mass destruction. The United States government, for almost 2 years, pushed narrative and produced documentation after documentation and evidence after evidence stating that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction. That was the whole reason why we went to war. And we didn't find any evidence. And the administration didn't say a damn thing about it. Because they knew that it was all horseshit. Now, the political backlash of this is pretty evident. But I'm pretty sure you guys were still young for this. The anti-war movement exploded around 2004. It exploded. The United States was going into an election season in 2004. Many people were worried that George W. Bush was not going to win re-election like his dad, with just the Afghanistan war taking place. A lot of people forget that there was a recession that took place in 2001, right before 9/11 took place. 9/11 didn't help anything. And so economically speaking, the United States is going through a stagnant era of growth. And so there was a lot of economic and local discontent. But issues like terrorism, immigration, and national security all of a sudden became really, really popular or really, really important in the American imagination after 9/11 for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. The Bush administration basically used that momentum to get the war in Iraq. And there's documentation showing that George W. Bush and his team went to war when they did, partially to get reelected. At the same time, the Democratic Party chose John Kerry to be their flag bearer going into the 2004 election.
I remember John Kerry. I sure do.
And John Kerry is a very problematic figure for many reasons. First and foremost, John Kerry had a very, how should I put this, colorful record when it came to his anti-war position, in that it really depended on where the popularity was. And so John Kerry voted for the United States invasion of Iraq. Less than a year later, or within a year, he now was against the war. So that didn't help anything. John Kerry also was a Vietnam War veteran who has had some flip-floppy positions on the Vietnam War throughout the years. Initially, he was a hero for being an anti-war veteran. He was known for throwing his Purple Heart with a group of people throwing their Purple Hearts away. And I believe he won the Purple Heart 2 or 3 times in his service, serving as a gunboat on a gunboat in Vietnam, which were basically fortified boats that patrol the rivers of Vietnam. And he wasn't very good, to say the least, in his debates. George W. Bush was able to keep hammering away at security. This led to the narrative that we get with Family Guy of 9/11. You've seen that episode of Family Guy where Lois becomes mayor, or tries to become mayor of Quahog, right?
Sure have.
That's
that's one of my favorite episodes.
But that's where that narrative comes from, because George W. Bush and his team, national security, immigration, and terrorism were constant themes. They hammered away on it. And George W. Bush was reelected very narrowly in 2004 against John Kerry. And the Iraq War basically dithered away. And the skeletons of the Cold War began to take root, or basically the seeds of destruction that we would have inevitably had to deal with were already planted and were already bearing fruit by this time. So Iraq becomes a hellhole by late 2004. Sunni Shia tension explode. Now some of this is provoked by external interests, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Saudis really are not comfortable with Iraq being the United States' pet government in the region, because Saudi Arabia wants to have leverage with the United States. So surprise, surprise, Saudi Arabia turns its back on potential radicals, particularly Al-Qaeda linked radicals going into Iraq and radicalizing the Sunni population. The Shia population is supported heavily by Iran. The Shia militia groups are heavily supported by Iran, and Iran is inadvertently supported by interests like Russia and China, who see a golden opportunity to basically force the United States to keep its eye off the ball for a decade or so. And so these military groups are well funded, and they're well organized, and they explode. Tensions explode. A car bomb goes off during a Shia holiday. This sparks ethnic or sectarian tension between Shia and Sunni, and a second civil war, or a civil war, kicks off. At this time, the United States military really was not strategically situated to handle the issue. Many of the intelligence agencies were warning the Bush administration that this was a highly probable outcome, and that if the United States didn't change policy or change direction, this would lead to considerable issues. This was ignored. And so United States military personnel were basically told that they were now a peacekeeping force. The heavy tanks and heavy material that the United States initially used in the war was removed, and most military units were transported in light military carriers, Humvees, or light trucks that would get them from point A to point B for policing actions. Now, the kind of RPGs, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, that the militia groups and the Islamist groups were able to get a hold of had piercing technology that was able to punch through Humvee plating. The landmines they were able to get a hold of were able to slice right through Humvees and these light personnel carriers as if they were nothing. From 2004 to 2007, the United States military was shredded. I mean, I can't begin to explain the horror of this because the Bush administration was denying that it was taking place 2 out of those 3 years. And when they finally did recognize that it was taking place, it took them about a year to change their overall strategy. The Iraq War led to the largest group of amputees in American military history since the Civil War.
Jesus Christ.
And the reason for that was these explosions, these RPGs. The metal of the Humvee, the plating underneath these light vehicle transports, would be turned into shrapnel that were capable of shredding people's legs, arms, body parts off. Now, fortunately, our medical technology had advanced to a point where we were able to save most of these soldiers' lives, but a lot of the soldiers who were injured during the war had some part of their body amputated as a result of the damage. This added on to the fact that the kind of military equipment that the ley line soldier would be armed with, the shielding, the armor plating, didn't exist at the time. Essentially put, the United States had a very light military force that was in place for police actions. And the reason for that was because of a figure that passed away recently, known as Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld believed in what was known as the Rumsfeld Doctrine, which was the principle of using as small of a military as possible with support of Air Force and high technology to basically suppress enemy actions as a way of basically doing more with less. Problem with that is it's not reactionary. It is reactionary. It's a completely reactionary kind of system, but it's a long-term process that requires a lot of planning, a lot of infrastructure in place to be successful. These militia attacks and these roadside bombs are immediate, and oftentimes there is nobody for you to shoot at. It's a hit and run, and then they disappear. So Donald Rumsfeld kept to this doctrine until he retired or was resigned in 2006. Surprisingly, around the same time that the Bush administration recognized that there was a major strategic problem in Iraq. Now, the reason why I bring this up is that the U.S. Congress flipped to the Democratic Party. So this was the first time since 1992 that the Democratic Party had control of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. This is how much the anti-war movement exploded in the United States. Within 3 years, the United States went from a relatively pro-war, we got to get kick-ass country to an anti-war country. A lot of this was due to the fact that the Iraq War was compared to the Vietnam War a lot, which I think has a lot of merit. Also, the Democratic Party began to capitalize on the fact that the Republican Party really didn't have any answers. And those issues that people like Phil Donahue brought up back in 2003 of longevity, of how long are we going to be there, What's our end goal? What's our timeline? What's our long-term goal in the region? We're starting to come up. So, in 2006, the Democratic Party takes power. By early 2007, the Bush administration is forced to change strategy. And this leads to what was known as the Surge. The Surge operation basically brought in heavy troops, heavy equipment, and we went from a police to occupation power. The Green Zone in Baghdad was reinforced, and the United States essentially became a military occupation once again. And we targeted both Sunni and Shia targets, and surprisingly enough, we actually bought off a lot of the Sunni militias, including a Sunni militia that was known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now I want you guys to remember that name, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, because they're going to come back to play a really important part in a few years to come. The United States then basically targets the Shia militias. At the same time, Iraq finally elects its own government, led by a man named al-Maliki, who was a Shia freedom fighter during the Saddam Hussein regime and had close ties to Iran. So this is where that, everybody in the region really doesn't want to support you thing comes into play. The Iranians were kind of seen by the Iraqi government as leverage to use against the United States to get their way. This is one of the reasons why the United States largely attacked the Shia groups, because not only were they the largest and best organized, they basically gave the Iraqi government more leverage in discussions. In result of all this, U.S. casualties go up and spike. The surge is labeled as a success by both sides, regardless. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what led to a de-escalation and hostility was the United States capitulating certain interests to the Iraqi government, and we basically took our ball and went back to our forts to wait the inevitable time where we would leave Iraq. But this would, of course, be in 2011. So from 2008 to 2011, the United States functioned primarily as heavy hitters for the Iraqi government. During this time, we formed close military ties to the Kurds, and surprise, surprise, we armed and equipped the shit out of them, because this gave us leverage over the Iraqi government. Al-Maliki was not happy about that. The Sunnis also wanted to see reforms put into place to protect their interests in Iraq, where the Shia were divided in multiple different camps. So there was no real unified bloc of Shia. So this constantly led to the Parliament of Iraq being at loggerheads. The Kurds, being well armed and well equipped, scared the living shit out of the Turks, who had their own long-term running war with the Kurdish radicals in Turkey. And the Kurds in northern Iraq were debating if they wanted to support a Kurdistan, so an independent Kurdistan in Iraq. This would eventually lead to the independent or the autonomous state of Kurdistan inside Iraq, which is kind of like a federal government or like a state government here in the States. It was given a more autonomy than the Sunni area of Iraq. This would lead to consequences in the future. Suffice to say, that's where we're at. The Obama administration ends up seizing power. We have a Great Recession, and people kind of take their eye off the ball of Iraq. And during this time, Al-Qaeda in Iraq changes its name. And that name change is ISIS. ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
Or ISIL. Also, in 2011, what else happens? The Syrian civil war takes place. And Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda, and Iran, as well as the United States, all see an opportunity to gain more leverage and more power in the region. That's some of the reasons why the Syrian conflict is a clusterfuck. During that time, ISIS becomes a major player and basically become more and more autonomous. The Sunni leadership, who were asking for more and more protections and interests and positions within the Iraqi government, are further ostracized by al-Maliki for various reasons. They get to a point where they're willing to work with ISIS and fund ISIS. And these are very wealthy, powerful figures in Iraq. This is one of the reasons why Western Iraq fell with very little struggle. The Sunni militia groups joined ISIS as they came through, and this left the Iraqi military, which was not very well trained or well equipped by the United States military, to face off against ISIS. And it fell apart, leaving a shit ton of equipment, high-grade, military-grade equipment, for ISIS to pick up. And this leads to the second civil war in Iraq, where the Kurds and the Iraqi government are basically facing off against the Sunni population and ISIS. Now, ISIS, of course, shoots itself in the foot by being a bunch of crazy, radical, batshit insane people. And they basically outwear their welcome for the Sunni oligarchs in Western Iraq. And eventually, the Iraqi government and the United States and the Kurds are able to drive ISIS out of Iraq. And that's kind of where we are now, where the United States military presence in Iraq is still there, but its military presence represent more what we see of the Rumsfeld doctrine, where the United States is using both the Kurds and the Iraqi military to be the heavy hitters, with our special forces support, with our air technology, our air power and technology supporting them. And that's where the Iraq War is now.
Freaking crazy. And I mean, I know we have like an exceptional Air Force, like a very strong one, but I mean, I just don't feel that it's effective in so many of those like hit and run tactics, you know?
Well,
it takes a minute to get everything rolled out with that.
Well, that changed with the ISIS campaign. With the ISIS campaign, it was a standing army. They just didn't have uniforms. So, but it was a standing army. So, and the United States, coupled with the Iraqi government and the Kurdish government, was able to eventually defeat ISIS. Well, the ultimate winners of the second civil war, I would argue, were the Kurds. And this was because that autonomy that I was telling you about was just reinforced due to the ineptitude of the Iraqi government. Mosul, which was the second largest city in Iraq, was captured by ISIS and served as a basically regional capital for ISIS. And the Iraqi government, it would take them almost 3 years to take it back.
Wow.
The Kurds were able to maintain autonomy, and the United States military presence in Kurdistan, Iraq, were able to hold back ISIS. And the United States was able to get concessions from the Kurdish government to basically build a military infrastructure in Iraq that the Iraqi government couldn't say a damn thing about, because Kurdistan is independent. So yeah, that's Iraq right now.
Yeah, you know, that's crazy. That's a lot of players there right now. Then
it's a long it's a long story. I mean, I could go into even deeper detail, but I mean, I think that as an overlay of the history, the political history of this, it can get even more complicated the deeper you go. Like I said, the Shia, like this idea of Sunni versus Shia, is a little overhyped. It's particular Sunni and Shia interest groups that have a considerable amount of backing from places like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah.
Most of the Sunni population and most of the Shia population, and even most of the militias, really don't have any backing. They are literally just personal bodyguards of local power factions. And that's just because of how unstable things are. A good way to think about it is that underneath Saddam Hussein, you had a unitary government that was a dictatorship. It was a one-party state. It was essentially a fascist state. And with its collapse, the United States government really didn't offer the Iraqi people much of anything. The United States government pushed a very strong neoliberal economic agenda down Iraq's throat. And a lot of infrastructure that was necessary to sustain the standard of living and quality of living for the Iraqi people was not rebuilt. This is where those canals and those dams being blown up made a huge part to play in this. So the Iraqi people's standard of living after the U.S. invasion collapsed and has not recovered. It hasn't recovered to pre-invasion era. So I want you guys to think about that. That in the 1980s, the Iraqi people actually had a fairly decent standard of living for the region. After the first Gulf War, that standard of living plummeted because of the sanctions. After the second Gulf War, that standard of living plummeted even further and has not recovered to where it was before the second invasion.
Gosh.
Yeah, that'll radicalize people.
Yeah. And so,
I think it also
and I didn't tell you about the biggest, stupidest thing. One of the stupidest things we did. So after we invaded and toppled the Saddam Hussein regime, we disbanded the Iraqi military. We disbanded the Iraqi police force. These are well-armed, well-trained soldiers that have a lot of connections, predominantly Sunni. Who do you think they joined up with?
I would say probably, Sunni or just really imperialist Western country groups then. At that point, they have a vendetta.
ISIS. They joined up with ISIS. They joined up with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We created Al-Qaeda in Iraq by disbanding the military. Because before they were a fringe element, and afterwards they became one of the largest Sunni militia groups. These are people with connections. When I said they disbanded the police force, I want you guys to understand the police force that we're thinking of. Think of KGB. That's the kind of level of connection until they had, and we disbanded them, and they joined ISIS.
Yeah, basically you gave them an enemy.
Move.
Yeah, there was even some discussions of having a private military force in Iraq that we were going to have. Yeah. So that's the beginning of the mercenary stage, the final last stage that we're in right now, that was largely pushed by the Trump administration. So instead of having special forces units supporting the Iraqi military, we now have mercenaries. Many of whom are post-special forces, special ops, but they're mercenaries.
So they're not held to the same standards as an actual U.S. soldier would be. Oh boy. This
began under the Bush administration. It continued under the Obama administration and was expanded by the Trump administration. So whenever you hear people say that Trump was anti-war and was pulling U.S. soldiers out of Iraq, you can tell them they're full of shit, because for every soldier that we pulled out of Iraq underneath Trump, 2 to 3 mercenaries replaced them. They just weren't in uniform.
My lord.
Yep.
Expensive, too.
More expensive. Way more expensive. But not politically expensive, because now we can say that our true presence there is X. When in reality, it's all the time higher.
Oh my gosh.
Well, and they have access. And the thing is, the United States military has given them access to the highest quality of military-grade equipment. So there are mercenary groups with Bradley, Omar Bradley, or what are they called? They're Bradley transport. They have tanks, helicopters, all technically underneath this jurisdiction of the United States, but under the operation of mercenary groups. And that's where we are now. That's where we are right now, 2021. Almost 2 decades since we started the war. So, and a decade after Obama pulled us out of Iraq. So that's the brief, fun political history of Iraq. I can go on even further.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, but I think the big thing is this also just highlights like a lot of like problems with interventionism in general.
Well, it's imperialism.
Yeah.
So the reality was the main reason why nobody wanted the United States to invade Iraq initially was because the concern was it would destabilize the region, because it would allow Iraq and Saudi Arabia more influence over the rest of the Middle East. And that kind of happened. So now there's 5 major players in the Middle East that the United States has to deal with. And before there was about maybe 2 or 3. And 2 of them were our allies. So now Israel, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran are all major players in the region. And the reason why they're major players in the region is because they are jettisoning either their radicals to the region to stir up trouble, or they're financing radicals in the region to stir up trouble. And this is designed to distract the United States in the Middle East.
Gosh.
So yeah, fun stuff.
Just made a worse mess. That is just humbling.
And to this day, we've not found any evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Our claim transitioned from weapons of mass destruction to developing and building a democracy. If you want to call Iraq a democracy, be my guest. It is
fighting for their freedom.
It's a kleptocracy at best, where very powerful Sunni and Shia interests are vying with one another for domination. Where the Kurds, the only place where there's any kind of semblance of democracy is perhaps in Kurdistan, and that is heavily influenced by the Kurdish military. So yeah, it's fun stuff, guys.
Yeah, it's just, as I said, humbling. Very humbling.
It should have been, honestly, as soon as we found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, I feel like that should have been an immediate, like, pull out. This isn't, that isn't, it's a very big reason to go into somewhere. Mm-hmm. And then when you don't find evidence for that, I mean...
Well, why do you think they didn't?
Actually, it's this now. Like, trying to just, like, subtly, let's move on to another kind of reason.
Two things. Okay? Do you think they actually believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in there, or were they lying through their ass?
No, they were lying. They were absolutely lying.
Yeah, they were lying, but
still. Second reason.
Lie better.
Well, no, second reason. We now, with us conquering Iraq, had more control over the oil reserve of the Middle East than ever before. We essentially had conquered an oil-producing country. This is the first time the United States had a oil-producing nation with the level of leverage that we had since Iran. So there's a reason why I started with the Iran Operation Ajax. Because this was U.S. foreign policy in the region for decades. So we're now at a really bad crossroads where we don't really have any solution to what we're going to do with Iraq. Because no matter what solution we choose to do, it's going to further destabilize the region. So, funny enough, most of the military experts who advised the Bush administration before the war warned of that outcome. We knew that this was going to happen before it happened, but we did it anyway. So recently, Donald Rumsfeld, the architect of a lot of the horrible shit that the Bush administration is remembered for, from Abu Ghraib to this wonderful doctrine of horseshit that led to thousands upon thousands of Americans dying and being maimed for the rest of their life.
Torture. And then there was also torture involved.
Then there was torture. That's what Abu Ghraib was. And then there was his fun little detail of illegal combatants, which allowed us to ship soldiers or militia groups that we captured to Egypt or Turkey to get tortured for us, or to Guantanamo Bay. He was also the person that gave us the enhanced interrogation technique line to describe our torture. So yeah. And the yellow cake figure that you remember most was a man by the name of Colin Powell, who essentially lied to the UN and lied to the United States people, stating that the yellow cake uranium that he had held was received from somewhere in Africa that was on its way to Iraq, which it wasn't. And there's enough documentation showing that he knew that it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he even held up a vial of it in on the floor. It was crazy.
It was a lie.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the United States committed a lot of war crimes. A lot of civilian deaths. Almost 1 million Iraqis died as a result of U.S. action. That's not including militia actions, starvation, malnutrition, disease. So yeah, that's the Iraq War.
Yeah, just humbling, as I said.
Do you guys have anything to say?
Honestly, it's sad to see. I'm almost speechless, but I guess what I would say is that it's unfortunate because we basically knew not only the consequences, but we knew outcomes. We knew that we were lying about it, and we still had people in charge that were do it.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the problems I have when people talk about, Trump's anti-war. The very people who surrounded Donald Trump are the exact same people who surrounded George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. They're either their underlings or they're the exact same people. Okay. Obama and Biden aren't great. But what I find troubling here is, in reality, when you look at the strategy the Obama administration took in Iraq and what the Biden administration is taking in Iraq right now, it is designed to extricate U.S. presence in the region. That is made 100 times worse by policies that the Trump administration committed to for its whole 4 years while in Iraq. Because those mercenaries are hard to account for. And it's hard to assess their activities. It's hard to assess who they are and where they are, because they're mercenaries. Other problem is we don't know where their loyalties lie, because they're mercenaries.
Yeah, I mean, their loyalties are bought. That's what it is.
So we're now left in this situation. What I want to really get at here is, as angry as I am at the Democratic Party for going along with this, the Republican Party lied through its fucking teeth every step of the way and spent decades defending the Bush administrations to invade Iraq. Only recently with Trump have they found any kind of wiggle room where they were able to extricate themselves from George W. Bush. Anybody who tells you that the Republican Party, the Republican candidate, the right-wing populists are anti-war, these exact same people supported George W. Bush. They supported Donald Trump. They aren't anti-war. They are imperialists. They don't give a fuck about what the Republican Party did or does while they're in power. They are full of shit and they're lying to you. They lied to me. They lied to my parents. They lied to the nation. They knew they were full of shit to begin with. And the faux populist rah-rah call to war resulted in almost 5,000 Americans dying, tens of thousands of Americans having incredibly debilitating physical ailments. And let's not talk about the hundreds of thousands that are dealing with mental illness as a result of this. And that's just the United States. There are millions of Iraqis.
Not even to talk about the millions of deaths we caused from that.
There are millions of Iraqis that are forever permanently scarred by this war, both mentally and physically. There are as a million Iraqis that are dead now that would otherwise be alive had we not invaded. So The reason why I'm reiterating this is very recent history, and people are already forgetting the lessons of this because they're choosing to look at bullshit narratives. Saying that you're anti-war and saying some anti-CIA, FBI talking points does not make you anti-war. It doesn't make you anti-imperialist. So I don't want to hear anybody talk to me about Tulsi Gabbard or Donald Trump, because they're both lying through their fucking teeth. There was only one candidate in the 2020 primary that was actually anti-war, and that was Bernie Sanders.
King.
So, now I'm going to get off my high horse. Do you guys have any closing statements, closing arguments?
As I said, that was definitely mine. It's unfortunate that we already knew outcomes and we still went forward with it, and we're paying the price for it now.
Yeah, I would say since oil played a huge factor, this is just yet another reason why we need to get off fossil fuels and switch over to more renewable energy, so that, you know, when our government's in the hands of horrible people, this isn't a factor for us to do horrible shit.
I would also say that what I would like to have seen is Obama prosecute every single one of those motherfuckers.
Yeah.
We have laws in the book for a reason. These are war crimes. The Bush administration, George W. Bush on down. The people who were in charge should have been held responsible, and they weren't. So Donald Rumsfeld dying in his bed surrounded by his loved ones is a fucking disgrace. So, suffice to say, guys, this has been Goodfellas History. If you liked what you see, what you hear, please like, subscribe, and comment down below and share.
Hi, guys.
Hi, guys.